Star Trek books. They've been around for decades. Join us, the Trek ladies, Kavura and Jen, as we discuss the novels one at a time. Welcome to the Ladies Trek Library. Hello, and we are back with Ladies Trek Library. I'm Kavura, and this is Jen.
Hey, Kavura. I'm glad to be back, and hello to all of our listeners again.
So this time our book is Black Fire by Sonni Cooper, published in 1983. And so I'll just read the back cover. Spock, a traitor? There is sabotage aboard the Enterprise, and Spock's investigation leads him into defiance of the Federation and a bizarre alliance with the Romulan and Klingon empires against the bloodthirsty Tomarii, a savage race for whom war and battle are life itself. Now Spock has been declared a traitor and condemned to the shame of the Federation's highest security prison, and now Captain James Kirk must face the toughest decision of his command, while a lifelong friendship and the destiny of the free universe hang in the balance. So that was a pretty good description of it. So this book was really interesting. It had some different things that we don't usually see in Star Trek books. So Spock kind of becomes a romantic figure. There are several women in the book who fall in love with him. What did you think about Spock as a romantic figure, Jen?
I thought it was interesting. So we had the several different kinds of relationships with Spock as a romantic figure. One was a character, Ilsa, who has imprisoned Spock but falls in love with him. And she kind of reminded me a bit of Christine Chapel, sort of pining after Spock, but she kind of knowing she's never going to be able to have him. Although, of course, Nurse Chapel didn't ever imprison Spock. But
yeah.
And then we have Julina, who is the Romulan commander, and she kind of reminds us a bit of the Romulan commander from the original series that Spock had a relationship with. And then the Romulan commander from the original series also makes an appearance, a brief one. And then we have Spock as a sort of folk romantic hero, although people don't know that it's Spock when he takes up pirating and becomes sort of a legendary space pirate who is known to be handsome and helping out ladies in distress.
Yeah, even though they didn't see his face as Black Fire, but very romantic figure there, and like mysterious, I think he was supposed to be, and glamorous, this pirate.
Yeah, and I thought that was really interesting, and it reminded me a lot of how you might see in fan fiction or in fandoms, Spock is the romantic character, but sort of a crossover with some sort of dashing pirate who helps out women. And I could see how, that would be a thing. So I thought it was funny.
It was very much like like a fan fiction book in a lot of ways, even though I kind of say that in a good way because fan fiction can be good. And this was, and I did enjoy the story. I'm a Spock fan, and I know you are too. And so it was kind of fun to see Spock in this light. So when he was with Ilsa, she basically had to take care of him. She was this warrior woman, and Spock had already been injured, and he had a piece of metal in his spine that had slipped. He couldn't walk. He could barely sit up for a while, and eventually he couldn't move at all. So she had to take care of him, and there's a part of the book where it said that she bathed him every day, and that was kind of cringy. You just go, oh, like,
yeah.
Did they really have to say that?
Yep.
Did they have to say that?
That was cringy.
Yeah. And so, but even Julina, the Romulan woman, also fell for him, but she was kind of, well, she wasn't like falling head over heels, like oh, I want to have you and all that. She wasn't quite as um, as forthright with him as Ilsa was. Um, oh,
Yeah,
and then there
she
were
was still very Romulan in her
she
personality.
was, yes. And there were also the two women that he rescued. That was another thing. As a pirate, when Spock, later on in the book, when he becomes a pirate, then he rescues those two women, and one of them basically writes a book about him, and well, it's because they all got to sit down at a dinner with him. That was funny, and so she wrote the book that had poetry about him, and there's actually a poem in the book that she wrote, which is very amusing. But
Yeah,
it was fun to see Spock in this way, just to see it in a new light, and because probably a lot of women do think of him in this way.
yeah, and the way that she did it, and I was going to get into this later, but I'll bring it up a bit. When I read these books, I try not to get any spoilers ahead of time. I don't read any reviews of them. I want to go into it, so that my mind is a blank slate and I'm not influenced by what other people have said. Um, so after I finish, I read some of the reviews, and I was actually pretty shocked at how many terrible reviews this book got. And a lot of it centered around not liking the legend of Spock as the folk hero, dashing pirate that these two women and this one woman in particular who wrote the book and the poems had created, and people thought it was cheesy, and they just really didn't like it. And if you just hear about it, it's one of those things where you think, oh yeah, that maybe kind of sounds like a terrible idea. But I think she executed it really well. Like I thought she really pulled it off. And I didn't, even though the idea is cheesy, that was kind of the fun about it. And even at the end of the book, McCoy teases Spock because he's found this book that has been a bestseller, and so he's even kind of
Yeah.
poking fun at it. So to me, it fit in really well with some of the humor of the original series. So, but that was my take. What did you think?
Yeah, I was surprised at some of the negative reviews too. I mean, I guess you have to be a Spock fan, and maybe you have to be someone who I don't know, someone who's a woman, I guess, who really to kind of see the humor of it, and maybe we have thought of Spock in this way sometimes. I mean, yeah, people, but real fans have written poems about Spock, romantic love poems about Spock. So yeah, I thought it was good, and when I first read this book as a child, I thought it was good, and then I always wondered, like, to go back and read it as an adult, would I enjoyed it as much? And I actually did. I mean, I thought it was still good, and so yeah. So you read the negative reviews, but I guess it just depends on the person how much you would like it.
Yeah, and I another thing that kind of shocked me as far as the negative reviews is, of course, this book has the introduction is by Theodore Sturgeon, so who wrote many Star Trek episodes, and he, the author was an assistant for William Shatner, and Theodore Sturgeon, from the introduction, we know that he's fairly close to the author, Sonni Cooper, and he seems to really like her book, and I thought she had a really great handle on all the characters. It was clear that the book was written by someone who loved Star Trek, and knew the characters and knew how to write them, and could write about it in a fun and lighthearted way without it being just campy and cheesy.
Right, definitely. And I liked that interview by Theodore Sturgeon, or the forward in the book, and that was interesting since he wrote original Star Trek episodes, and then to have him do this intro to the book was great, and it actually brings us to the next subject, because he talked about how the book is about loyalty, about Spock's loyalty to Kirk, and dealing with what would happen when you have divided loyalties. He called it a conflict between loyalty and the bonding of friendship and personal commitment. And the book does talk about Spock when he was thinking about his loyalty to Kirk and how he made friends with this new Romulan named Desus, and Spock is also becoming loyal to Desus. How did you feel about that loyalty that Spock had to Desus?
He didn't know him very well, but he quickly developed a relationship with Desus similar to the one that he had with Kirk. And I don't know that maybe a part of me felt like it was a little fast, but of course, Desus helps Spock escape from prison. He, basically helps him when he's now out of prison and the Federation's most wanted, and he has to, be on the lam. And then he finds out, of course, we'll get into spoilers, but that Desus really isn't exactly who he thought. But he ends up having more respect when he learns, what Desus has done, that he's a really loyal and he's a good commander. So I could see how, he would have this. And he says there's several times where Spock is saying in the book that he's even surprised at how much he has in common with Desus and how similar they seem and how their friendship has kind of developed very closely over a quick period of time because he feels this affinity for him.
Yeah, I did feel like it happened kind of fast. When Spock was put in a Federation prison, and Desus is one of his roommates. He has several roommates in his cell, but there was a time when Spock told Desus, "I plan to get out of here," and the book explains later about why Spock was acting, weird in that way. But the point is, he was like, Spock told Desus, and I just thought, like, why would he trust him to tell him that so soon? When we're reading the book, it seems like he hasn't known him long enough to trust him for things like this. But I guess he was I think he was there because he kind of knew that Desus was the person he was looking for to help him escape at the time, and it worked. Of course, it worked very well, and maybe a little too well for a story. But they explained they explained some of the things in the book that the escape was actually helped by Starfleet, because this was all Spock was sort of working undercover, but Desus didn't know that. But it was interesting to see their relationship develop. Some things, it was too much of a coincidence, like saying that Spock and Desus were about the same height and size, so that both of them could bleed. They could both be black fire, and everyone would think it was just one person that was extremely fast, but they actually had separate ships, so you could do one ship does something here and the other ship does something far away that's only a short time later, so people think it's one ship and that it's really fast. But yeah, so some things are too coincidental, like, yeah, that's a little too far-fetched. But
Yeah, there were some far-fetched moments, although the author does try to explain some of that by Spock, even when he's thinking about this in his mind, like, oh, how is it that I've really developed this affinity for Desus so quickly, and it took years for me to develop an affinity with Kirk like this. And then he kind of thinks, well, maybe it's because, Kirk is human, and so we have those differences, whereas Desus is Romulan, and that's, Romulans and Vulcans are related, and so maybe because we're more biologically similar that we, think more along the same lines. I don't know if I necessarily bought that, since we know Romulans and Vulcans are pretty different, but that's one of the reasons she explained that.
And so it was kind of like Kirk understands more Spock's, or can relate to the human half, and Desus could relate more to the Vulcan half. I mean, you kind of get that dichotomy there, and yeah, but it was interesting. That's how the author shows how she really knows these characters, by having Spock thinking so much about his loyalty to both of these people, and how he sees this friendship with Desus, and he's kind of thinking, how did this happen? He's a Romulan, and they are very different from Vulcans. Their moral code is different. And I also like how the book examined Kirk when Kirk had his thinking about, like, he didn't know where Spock was, and he was saying, like, well, to himself, Spock is such a great friend, and I really care about him, and and I hope he's okay. And those things are just very, very good moments in this book.
Yeah, now that I think about it, you are right about Desus probably relating more to the Vulcan half, even though we know that Vulcans are suppressing their emotions. There's other similarities between Romulans and Vulcans that maybe are not the same between humans and Vulcans, and so Spock could relate to Desus on some level there.
And really, it's amazing how Desus was so open to being friends with Spock. I mean, he saw something in Spock that he liked right away, which was also like the female Romulan commander in the Enterprise incident, and maybe even Jolena too. Like they all see something special in Spock for some reason. It's kind of maybe it makes you wonder, or maybe Romulans are like that with all Vulcans, but yeah, something where Deesa seemed to really trust Spock and made him like basically his second in command when they were on the pirate planet, and then later when they go to Romulus, and Desus becomes his second in command on his ship.
Yeah, and another thing about that that maybe people were commenting about, and I kind of agree. Desus also, in addition to Spock finding himself trusting Desus very quickly, even though he doesn't know him well, Desus is feeling the same way about Spock and really comes to trust him completely in a very short amount of time, and makes him commander or second in command, but commander of one ship. And even when Desus gets back to the Romulan Empire, and he's kind of making Spock in charge of this operation against the Tomarii, I kind of thought, do you really think a Romulan commander is going to trust a Vulcan who's a former, Federation
Yeah,
officer?
right. Exactly.
Now, of course, the story is that Spock had been condemned as a traitor by the Federation, but still, we know if it was the other way around, I don't think the Federation would so easily trust a former Romulan commander. So
Yeah, so yeah, there are things like that. Some things go a little beyond belief in the book, even though it's still it's this one's just a fun story, like you can't take it too seriously.
yeah.
So now with Spock being gone for most of the book, and Kirk is back on Enterprise, how well did you think like Kirk handled, Spock being gone, and then they were three new officers on the Enterprise because they had a new, it took two people to replace Spock, right? A new science officer, a new first officer, and then also a new chief engineer because Scotty had also been in prison because he had actually gone with Spock, and so they both had to stand trial together when they had both left Starfleet for a time during the time that Spock was being taken care of by Ilsa. Scotty was also there, so he had also been found a traitor. So Kirk on the Enterprise. So how do you think he handled these, like having these new officers?
Well, I think he handled it in typical Kirk fashion, which is not well considering the
Yeah.
circumstances. I mean, the way that it happened is kind of Kirk had been seriously injured and they didn't know if he was going to live. And so the way that they handled it was just not to tell him because they didn't want to anger him during his recovery. So he gets back on the Enterprise and finds out, oh wait, Spock and Scotty are gone, and I have three new officers who are here now. We're about to leave on our mission, which was kind of a little silly how that
Yeah, I
happened.
mean, like,
But
wait a minute, what? Okay, yeah.
um, and he's kind of he's pretty angry about the situation, and he wasn't consulted, or nobody told him when Spock and Scotty left, and everything that had happened. And he's pretty determined not to like these three men who've come in to replace them. Now, the science officer and the new chief engineer, they're pretty minor. We don't really, hear much about them. They're kind of in the background. We know that Kirk is kind of annoyed just because they're replacements, not because of anything they did in particular. The new first officer, we hear more about him, Leonidas, And you can tell in the beginning, Kirk, in a very Kirk manner, is determined not to like him because he's not a replacement for Spock. But this guy turns out to be pretty popular. Really good-natured guy. The crew really like him, and eventually Kirk kind of has to admit to himself, well, you know what, he's really not so bad. I do kind of like this guy.
Wasn't he was the one that taught the dance lessons? Yeah,
Yeah.
he taught dance in the rec room, and so everyone on the ship seemed to like him. He got along pretty well. Nice, seemed like a friendly guy at first. Yeah, and then the other guy, Martin, didn't think that Kirk liked him. So it's kind of, yeah, and then being the engineer and didn't like having to tax the engine so much, which Scotty would have been like that too. So I thought Kirk handled it all right. I mean, like they're new officers, and so it takes time to get used to them. So he's kind of like, yeah, he didn't like the idea that they had to be there. But I kind of like the development of them was pretty good. Like the one that had the beads, and it just said that he kept making noise with his beads on the bridge, and Kirk was annoyed at that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I just liked that it was something thrown in. That at least that was good development there to have that.
Yeah,
And
kind of like a physical representation of Kirk's annoyance at these
yes,
new officers. Yeah.
but it was interesting that it took two people to replace Spock, which is interesting. Okay. And then when like later when Spock does come back, when they rescue him, and then Leonidas says that they have to put him in the brig because he's a traitor who had been sentenced and then escaped, and so and Kirk didn't want to, but he sees that, well, I mean, legally that is what they need to do. So all of these things going on in these situations that Kirk has to deal with. But I kind of thought that having the new characters on the Enterprise, a lot of the novel writers back then wouldn't do something like that. And I just thought it was a good turn, and kind of reminded me of some things that happened on the Next Generation, like replacing Picard with Captain Jellicoe for an episode and things like that. It just I think, and some of that added more realism to the book, even though there's so many things that are far-fetched in the book. Assigning new officers was something that you think really would happen in this kind of situation.
Yeah, you're right. You don't, I mean, we didn't really see that on the original series itself, and not often in the novels. I can't really think of too many novels where, I mean, of course, there's the ones that are post-film era where we have replacements because the crew have been promoted and, Sulu becomes the captain, has his own ship and that kind of thing. But otherwise, you don't really see that. So it was interesting to see this.
And yeah, and to see the dynamic of how the crew would react to them. Um, because I think no one else really took it as badly as Kirk did, which you can understand. And so, getting on to some other final thoughts about the book. Now, I know you would probably want to talk about this we know that Spock is a vegetarian, and that's something that comes up a lot in this book. It's a big issue.
Yes, so when Spock is being held on by the Tomarii, by Ilsa, the Tomarii live in a very hostile world where, because of, I guess you could call it climate change, but as a result of some stuff in the atmosphere with the suns, their planet is becoming more and more of like a frozen tundra, and there's really only like a small part of the planet that's even inhabitable, and that's like pretty cold. Now the Tomarii are hairy, and they, can survive in cooler temperatures, but it's even for them becoming where most of the people have left the planet because it's just not habitable anymore. So there's not really plant life on there. And so the Tomarii are basically just eating meat of these animals that live on the planet. Of course, I would always ask, well, what are the animals eating? Because
Yeah.
they have to be eating something. They
Yeah, I
don't
didn't
really.
think about that. Yeah.
So when Spock tells Ilsa, that he's not going to be eating any of this food because it's not vegetarian, she's basically at first is going to say, oh, well, you'll just starve then. But eventually they're able to like gather up, they said, some what I think are like weeds, and and he's eating these what little plant life exists on the planet. So he's sort of slowly starving to death on this plant diet. Um,
Yeah, he was and he was already weak. He already couldn't stand up, and so to not get the nourishment that he needed was pretty bad. And yeah, and they did say something like it they could import vegetables, but they never did in the book. So, they never came. They said it would take a long time. So, but yeah, that and the way Ilsa taunted him with it. Sometimes if she was angry at him, then she would put a bowl of meat in his reach and put like a glass of water further away that he couldn't reach. I mean, things like that. It was just, oh, so he was, really being tortured for a time. And then also when he was in the Federation prison, and then his assignment, he said he thought people would get assigned to something that would have to do with their skill set, but instead they assigned Spock to help. Was it with the pigs? They used the pigs to eat, but you had to maintain them. So Spock was supposed to be there to help maintain the pigs, which that was his assignment, and which he didn't want to do. So a lot of these things came up. You have to wonder. I guess the author must be vegetarian, because it's just mentioned so many times. And Spock would still, I mean, he did his duty assigned when he was assigned to help the pigs, but he still would not eat meat, even when, being on Tomarii, where there was nothing else to eat except for a few flowers and water, and he stuck to it the whole time.
yeah, I don't know that I got. I mean, we may be able to find out by researching online, or maybe not. But I don't know that I necessarily thought the author was a vegetarian. But I think she was more trying to show the kind of how Spock was being tortured, and just that Spock is someone who's going to stick to his beliefs, um, no matter what. And it was kind of a contrast, and I think this was intentional because the whole time the reader doesn't know that Spock's undercover. Although I think I had suspicions early on, the fact that the Federation doesn't want to investigate this explosion on the Enterprise that Spock believes is sabotage, and they're just like, nope, it was an accident.
Hmm.
And then they send Spock to a prison, and after he's been tortured by these Ilsa and the Tomarii. So I felt kind of like, even though I didn't know what was going to happen, I wasn't sure. I had a suspicion, like, oh, there's more to it than this. Like, obviously he's undercover or something. There's something that we don't know. So I think that was a contrast, because if you didn't think about that and you're like, wait, okay, so here Spock is a traitor, although what he did wasn't, all he did was send a message to the Romulans that to warn them of the Tomarii, because he had promised the Romulans that he had been on the planet with, that if any of them got back alive, they would all warn the Federation and the Klingon Empire and the Romulans about the threat of the Tomarii. So that wasn't, I didn't really view that as being so much of a traitor. But when he becomes the pirate, and you're kind of like, okay, this is not really Spock sticking to his morals, but yet we saw him sticking to his morals, refusing to eat the meat, even when, the reason he had been captured was that they wanted to use him as a fighter, and he had remained strong, and he's basically starving to death, but having to perform all these physical activities. So I thought there was like a contrast, and it was maybe kind of a hint, like, hey, we know Spock sticks to his morals, so obviously this thing about him becoming a pirate probably is not what you think it is.
That's true. They threw out some hints that something was going on. Actually, there was one part of the book where Spock was thinking this might turn out better than I thought, and so the first time you read it, you're wondering what that was about. And the fact that when he first reported to the prison, he got to speak to the warden in private, and as the reader, you don't see that conversation, but you know that something's going on if Spock got to speak to the person in private, and then he comes out Spock came out of the meeting and spoke to the guard, and the guard felt like Spock was kind of, well, a little too proud there to be a prisoner. That those were there were kind of hints that were thrown out, and yeah, and then Spock becoming a pirate. Well, yeah, you don't think that Spock would do that, but then the book explains it. So there, yeah, there is at least an explanation for that part being so far fetched, but there is a reason for it. And that is a good point that they wanted on Tomarii. They wanted Spock to fight, but they didn't really give him the food he needed, this and the strength that he needed to fight. He was able to do when he first got there. He was able to participate in a fight where they were practicing, but then later on where he was laid up and couldn't move anymore. So a lot of things happened in this book. There were so many scenes because he was on Tomarii and then on Corsair, the pirate planet, and then later he went to Romulan space. So a very good like adventure story here. Any other thoughts?
Well, I had an interesting thought about the cover of the book, because the cover of the book shows a Klingon ship attacking the Enterprise, which never happened in the
Yeah,
book.
yes.
And at no point were the Klingons there was no confrontation between the Enterprise and the Klingons in this book, although there were Klingons in the book on the planet Tomarii. And when you read the little bit about it in Memory Beta, other people have noted that too, and it even said that in the German edition of the book, the cover for Web of the Romulans was used, and that cover is basically just Kirk, Spock, and McCoy on the front. So yeah, I don't know that the cover is really fits. I mean, maybe the person who did the artwork hadn't read the book or had just designed it as a general Star Trek cover, and they were like, "Oh, let's use it for this," even though it doesn't really
Yeah,
fit.
it's strange. I think sometimes they didn't, or I think they wanted just to have the ships just to they thought it would sell more books probably. The best I
Yeah.
can think of. And of course having the motion picture uniforms on the cover, which does fit the book. That's another thing about this book. It was in this book it says it's the first time that they had to wear those uniforms. And I just thought that was interesting. Oh, they're doing this changeover now. This book was published in '83, but that movie came out in '79. But they just wanted to say this is the changeover to the new uniforms. Um,
Yeah, and they do mention a bit about like the bridge being refitted and that kind of thing.
yeah, it's supposedly the first time they had the new Enterprise too.
But other than that, the other thing I'd like to say is, you know, we've talked a bit about the criticism of it and how in some ways it is a bit of a cheesy story. But I actually thought, to me, it felt like very much like a original series episode. Like I could totally see this being an episode. Of course, it'd have to be condensed quite a bit because it spans a pretty long period of time. But I felt it fits in perfectly, even down to the humor between McCoy and Spock at the end. And um, I just think it's a great story if you're a fan of the original series. I think everybody would enjoy it.
Yeah, I agree. It was a fun story, and it was also original, and you get to see something that you don't usually see. I mean, it's great to have Spock do all these things, and there's also a reason for it, so you can make it fit. Some other things I noticed, like so the Tamarians doing their where they kidnap people and make the people fight in their war. That was also similar to there's another book called The Enterprise War
I haven't
that's
read
by
that
John
one.
Jackson Miller. You did read it?
No, I have not.
Oh, okay, you haven't. It's one, yeah, and so that's one of the more recent books, and it takes place during the Pike era, but it's the Anson Mount Pike. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting. So it's a similar um, type of people. They're the race that kidnaps people and makes them fight for them. So
Yeah, no.
maybe,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah. So I said maybe John Jackson Miller got the idea from this, or who knows?
Yeah, and the other thing that was interesting, and I know I've seen it, I may have seen it on an episode, I may have read it in a book. I know it's been in Star Trek somewhere else, and maybe something that came later, or maybe something that came earlier. but the idea that the Tomarii they were a race of people who didn't really have their own technology. Everything they had gotten from stealing and conquest. So they sort of had this hodgepodge of stuff. And when Spock and Scotty and the Romulans and the Klingons get kidnapped and they go to their planet, they're like, oh, it's kind of weird. They're using some old technology for some stuff, but yet they've got, other newer technology here. And it's all stuff that they've just taken from different cultures and put together. And they really didn't know how to work it too well. I think there were people there that knew how to sort of fix it, but their strategy was, rather than like developing their own stuff, if the stuff they had started to fall apart, they would just like steal newer stuff. And I know I've seen that before somewhere, but that was kind of interesting. And also at the same time kind of made you think, how are the Tomarii supposed to be this big threat if they don't even have their own technology? They're just basically a people who are just, stealing stuff. So that
Right,
was,
yes.
yeah.
Stealing stuff and forcing a lot of people to fight. Yeah, some of that does seem strange. As
Like,
far as having other
I was gonna say, like, can we really believe there's a giant threat to the Federation, the Romulan Empire, and the Klingon Empire?
right, they said
You
that,
know?
yeah. I mean, you have to make them dangerous though, or else it's not as much of a story.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, stealing other people's technology. I mean, I know like the Packlids did that, and they would and it was mentioned more recently on lower decks. They had the Packlids, and they had this ship that was an amalgam of all different technologies. That was one example of that. I think it's happened before, but that's something that stands out to me. Spock and Desus played chess in the book. I mean, I like that. That was just, and Spock taught Desus how to play it. So that was pretty neat because it's something that Spock does with Kirk, and so he liked doing it with his new friend who would also be good at that game.
And you know what? It's coming back to me now. I did read, when you mentioned Captain Pike, I realized I have read the Enterprise War. I read that when it
Okay.
first came out. So yes, and now it's coming back to me. But that was but they were a more high-tech society. They had those battle suits where they, the different colored battle teams with the, sophisticated gear and all that. Okay.
Yeah, they did.
But yeah, that you're right. That might have been they were kidnapping people to fight in their wars, people from all different races. So yeah, maybe John Jackson Miller did read this book and get that idea.
Okay, so in the end, I guess we both liked it. I'm gonna say like 4 out of 5 Quatloos. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I want to say I gave it 4 stars on my Goodreads review. So yeah, I would definitely say like 3.5 to 4 Quatloos. I really enjoyed it.
All right. And thanks, Jen, for a good episode.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, and I was glad to talk about this book.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.